For over 3 decades, a nameless girl haunted the fields of upstate New York. She was known only by the place where she was found, a small farming community that would never forget her. This is the story of how a chance discovery in 1979 launched one of America's most enduring mysteries, and how a new generation of investigators and online investigators refused to let her be forgotten. Today, we are talking about a cold case that captured the attention of web investigators, leading to extraordinary discoveries. So, let's pour ourselves a cup, settle in, and step quietly into the shadows of this cold case together. On a brisk autumn morning in 1979, a quiet farming community in upstate New York awoke to a harrowing discovery. In a rain-soaked cornfield just off US Route 20 outside the village of Colonia, a local farmer checking the fields stumbled upon what he first thought was perhaps a trespassing hunter in a red jacket. But as he drew closer, his heart sank, because it was the lifeless body of a girl face down amid the cornstalks, and she had no identification on her, and it was immediately clear she had met a violent end. The farmer phoned the Livingston County Sheriff's Office, setting in motion a mystery that would haunt the region for decades. So, when police arrived at the scene on what would later be recorded as November 10th, 1979, they noted that the girl was young, but her true age was still unclear at this stage. They knew that she had been shot, and this girl died by 2 gunshot wounds. One was a shot to her right eye, and another to her upper back. Positioning of the wounds and a large blood spot by the roadside suggested a grim sequence. That sequence would be that she was most likely first shot by the road, then dragged roughly 20 feet into the cornfield, and shot again in the back. The girl's pockets were turned inside out, as if someone had rifled through them to remove any form of identification, and in the dirt beneath her body, recovered a single .38 caliber bullet slug, evidence of the murder weapon that had been used to end her life. So, sheriff's deputies secured the crime scene, combing through the muddy field and adjacent roadside for any physical evidence. And rain had fallen very heavily during the night, and officers quickly realized that crucial clues might have been literally washed away by the storm. And the downpour had likely obliterated any sort of footprints or tire tracks, and any trace of DNA that the killer might have left on the victim's body or clothing. Despite the challenging conditions, though, investigators did recover some evidence and noted several key details. They found no purse, wallet, or documents on the girl. Nothing to indicate who she was. And the fact that her pant pockets were pulled inside out suggested the killer had perhaps taken her money and ID with them. This was a strong indication of an attempted her identity had been deliberately concealed. Yet, beyond that, she was fully clothed and showed no visible signs of harm or struggle. Apart from the gunshot wounds, there were no other signs of violence. This raised the question of whether the crime stemmed from robbery or a more personal motive. Investigators also noted that a .38 caliber round had been recovered beneath the body. Ballistic experts would later determine it likely came from a handgun of that caliber. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death was massive hemorrhaging from the 2 gunshot wounds. The shot over her eye appeared to have been fired at very close range. It's the fact that the victim did not flinch or turn indicates she was likely taken by surprise when the trigger was pulled. The follow-up shot to her back appeared to have been fired once she had already fallen. Investigators scoured the area for anything the killer might have left behind. Aside from the bullet, investigators found two peculiar objects with the body that hinted, however slightly, at the victim's recent travels. Because attached to the victim's belt loops were two metal keychains. One was heart-shaped, with a keyhole and inscribed with the phrase, "He who holds the key can open my heart." The other was the matching key meant to fit that heart. The cheap keychain trinkets were eventually traced to vending machines on the New York State Thruway, a highway stretching across the state. This detail pointed to the victim, and likely her killer, having passed along that road not long before, stopping at a rest area for the small souvenir. A small clue, but telling nonetheless, suggesting the journey ended here, in this town, for the young woman. Alongside the keychains, investigators also recovered a necklace. She wore a delicate silver necklace with 3 small turquoise stones. The necklace had a handmade southwestern look, resembling Native American-style jewelry. This style isn't common in rural New York, leading investigators to wonder if the necklace and the girl herself came from somewhere in the American Southwest. So, coupled with the 3-way keychains, the necklace hinted at long-distance travel before death. So perhaps a road trip that started in a far warmer place than Western New York. As forensic teams collected what evidence they could, detectives canvassed the local area for leads. Also, given the contents of the victim's stomach, the coroner determined she had eaten a meal not long before she was killed. Potatoes, sweet corn, and ham were found undigested. So this pointed to a classic diner-style dinner. Remarkably, a waitress from a small diner in the nearby town of Lima believed she had served this girl the night of November 9th, 1979. Because the young woman had been in the diner at around 11:30 p.m. with an older male companion who paid for their meals. At the time, the waitress saw nothing out of the ordinary. The pair looked no different from any other late-night customers. This detail proved significant, as it placed the victim alive just hours before her death, alongside a man who might have been responsible. From her account, investigators obtained a description of the unidentified companion. He was described as a white male, around 5'8" to 5'9", with black wire-rimmed glasses and curly hair. He drove a tan station wagon that night, so, to investigators, this man immediately became a person of interest, perhaps the last person seen with the victim while she was alive, which meant that if they could find and identify him, they might solve this case. Police circulated a sketch of the curly-haired man and issued an alert for tan station wagons fitting the account. This man had shared a meal with the young woman, and less than an hour later, her life was over. Her body left in a field. As the waitress, Marge Bradford, later wondered in horror, why would you buy somebody dinner and then kill them 45 minutes later and throw them in a cornfield? It was a deeply unsettling question investigators were determined to pursue. During the early stages of the inquiry, the victim was still unidentified, and a full autopsy was performed to create a comprehensive profile that might one day link her to a missing person. Examiners placed her age somewhere between 13 and 19 years old. She was petite, about 5 feet 3 inches tall, and weighed around 120 pounds. She had an athletic, tanned build, unusual for someone for the chilly northeast in November. The exam also noted pronounced tan lines across her upper body, in the shape of a halter top or bikini. This suggested she had likely been in a sunny climate not long before her death. At the time, tanning beds were virtually unheard of, and upstate New York certainly wasn't warm enough for sunbathing in late October. So, the tan lines were an early red flag that the victim was not a local girl. The girl's hair was light brown, wavy, and shoulder length, The front locks had been highlighted about 4 months before her death, with darker roots beginning to show. Her eyes were a soft brown. The medical examiner also noted some acne on her face and chest, along with freckles dusting the back of her shoulders. In terms of distinguishing marks or old injuries, Jane Doe had no tattoos, no scars, and no healed fractures that might have appeared in hospital records. It also seemed she had received very little medical or dental care throughout her life, a fact that could hint into her background, because her teeth specifically were in poor shape and she had multiple untreated cavities, including one tooth so decayed that only the roots remained. And one source mentioned there were signs of a bit of dental work that was done which appeared substandard, noting it might have been performed outside the US, given its unusual technique. The girl had no fillings or orthodontic work typical of American teens, which reinforced the idea that she might have come from a less privileged background, or perhaps was a transient without regular medical care. None of her wisdom teeth had erupted, consistent with a young age, likely under 18. Her blood type was determined to be A negative, though without someone to match it to, this detail was mostly filed away for future reference. Most importantly, the clothing she wore offered further clues. At the time of discovery, she was fully dressed in everyday attire that would not have seemed unusual for a teenager in the 1970s. Perhaps that some items were ill-fitted or masculine. She wore tan corduroy pants, women's size 7, and multicolored plaid button-up shirt with a collar. Over the shirt was the most eye-catching item, and that was a red windbreaker jacket with black stripes down the arms, men's style, labelled Auto Sports Products, Inc. on the inside. It looked like a racing or automotive jacket, and investigators tried to trace it, but they soon learned it had been a promotional item produced in limited quantity and not traceable to any particular owner. On her feet were brown shoes with ripple soles. She was also wearing blue knee-high socks, a white bra, and blue underwear. All of the clothing appeared to have been purchased off the rack. Nothing bespoke or especially distinctive, apart from the red jacket and the personalized keychain charms. But the overall impression was that of a normal American teen or young woman of the late 70s, perhaps one who was traveling or had run away, wearing practical clothes for comfort. Piece by piece, the physical evidence was catalogued, and photographs of the girl's face were taken. Her features, still recognizable despite the wound near her eye, allowed police to release a carefully retouched post-mortem image and a sketch to the media in the hope that someone might come forward. Yet in those first days, no matches surfaced. Authorities combed through missing person reports across New York State and neighboring areas, searching for any teenage girl who fit her description. None aligned with Jane Doe. Her fingerprints were forwarded to the FBI's national database, but they too came back with nothing. It seemed she had never been printed by law enforcement or any agency connected to the FBI. There was no record of her at all, leaving investigators at the outset with a daunting puzzle. Here was a young woman with tan lines suggesting a life in sunny climates, found dead far from home, wearing a mishmash of clothes and carrying trinkets from roadside stops. She shared a modest last meal with a stranger, who may also have been her executioner. There were no immediate answers, only questions echoing in the minds of investigators and townspeople alike. Who was Jane Doe? How did she come to be in Caledonia? Who had murdered her, and why? So from the very start, the Colonia Jane Doe case weighed heavily on the hearts of investigators involved. And one man in particular would become the steadfast guardian of Jane Doe's memory. John York, a Livingston County deputy sheriff, who was one of the first officers on the scene that November morning. So John York was deeply moved by the sight of the murdered girl and the tragedy of her anonymity. As the years passed, York's career moved forward, and by the 1980s, he was elected Livingston County Sheriff, a role he would hold until 2013. Through all those years, he refused to let the Jane Doe case slip into the past. Sheriff York made certain that Cali remained an active investigation. She was called Cali because of where she was found, reminding his department and the public that this girl was never forgotten. York's dedication was not only professional but also deeply personal. He would often visit the unidentified girl's grave, speaking to her in his thoughts and asking for forgiveness that her killer had never been found. In his own words, "What did we forget? What did we overlook? Here's a child shot, left by the roadside, shot again, stripped of identification. Somebody has to give that child justice." He would remark, emphasizing the sense of obligation he felt, and in his words, quote, "You don't think that kid deserves some justice?" So the case was a promise he meant to keep. And in the earliest years after 1979, York and the investigative team pulled out all the stops to identify the girl and hunt down the murderer. But with no name to start from, the first priority was giving Cali Doe back her identity. Since one of the biggest parts of solving this case is knowing the victim. As Sheriff Thomas Dorr would say, in 1979 and the early 1980s, this meant painstakingly checking missing persons reports by hand, reaching out to departments near and far, and appealing in the media for anyone who knew the girl who vanished to come forward. Leads began arriving in waves, first by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Over time, Sheriff York reported that more than 10,000 tips were reviewed, an extraordinary volume that underscored both the complexity of the case and the relentless drive to chase down even the faintest clue. Early on, investigators also circulated flyers with the girl's description and clothing, distributing them to police departments not only across the United States, but also in Canada and overseas. So this was a massive pre-internet outreach effort to see if any agency had a similar cold case or a missing girl who might match. And John York's law enforcement students even assisted in stuffing envelopes and addressing them, learning firsthand how a real case was pursued with dogged determination. And the team compared notes with missing persons databases. But the late 1970s and 80s lacked a digital, centralized national system. So, it was like searching for a needle in a haystack by candlelight. And sadly, none of the countless inquiries produced a name for Cali Doe. And realizing the killer might not be a local either, investigators scored truck stops, rest areas, and highway records. Because Colonia sits not far from the interstate highway and the thruway. If the victim and her killer had been on the move, there was a chance a trucker or gas station worker might have noticed them. Investigators went through diners and fuel stops, asking about the curly-haired girl and the man with glasses, and a few leads began to surface. A few long-haul truck drivers reported possibly seeing a teen girl hitchhiking along the highway in that area, around the time of the murder. And this fueled a theory that Jane Doe had been hitchhiking her way through New York, which fit the narrative of a runaway or traveller. However, without confirmation of who she was, these sightings remained frustratingly vague leads, and they suggested a scenario but not a name. By the end of 1980, the case had gone cold in terms of identifying the victim. Despite extensive efforts, no family had come forward to claim her, and no missing persons report in any database matched her unique combination of characteristics. It was heartbreaking, as though no one was searching for this girl. At least not in the right places. So, with great reluctance, Livingston County authorities arranged for Cali Doe's burial about a year after her death. So in 1980, she was laid to rest in Greenmount Cemetery, under a headstone that read, "Lest we forget. Unidentified girl, November 1979, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest." But the beautiful Shakespearean sentiment on the stone was a promise that although her name was unknown, she would not be forgotten by this community. A small group of locals and law enforcement officers attended her funeral. Strangers, moved by the plight of a lost girl. John York, in particular, took it to heart that Caledonia had adopted this nameless teenager in death, and that as long as he remained in office, she would have someone to speak for her. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the Sheriff's Department kept working the case, following every lead they could. Because if a teenage girl went missing anywhere in the country that even remotely fit the time frame and description, the team compared dental records, descriptions, just anything available to see if it could be matched to Cali Doe. Over the years, thousands of law enforcement agencies were contacted. The case file grew thick with correspondence and reports from across the United States, and even abroad, as Interpol and Canadian authorities were alerted in case the victim had come from outside the country. But still, every promising lead seemed to hit a dead end, and not a single missing persons report lined up with Colonia's Jane Doe. It was as if she had never officially been reported missing at all, which is a deeply unsettling thought that implied she might have come from a troubled home or transient life, where no one realized or cared that she was gone. But investigators didn't give up, and the case even received some national media attention. A segment of the Colonia Jane Doe aired on the popular TV program America's Most Wanted. Although America's Most Wanted usually focused on fugitives, the program occasionally highlighted Jane or John Doe cases in hopes of sparking new leads. The episode on Caledonia Jane Doe brought a rush of calls, from well-meaning citizens, amateur sleuths, even psychics. But none of it unlocked her identity. As the years passed, frustration deepened. By the early 2000s, the case had become the most extensive and costly in Livingston County's history, consuming thousands of hours and resources, yet offering no resolution. Still, Sheriff John York kept his promise. The file never closed. Every piece of evidence was carefully preserved. The red jacket, the clothing, the bullet slug, the necklace. For decades they rested in storage, waiting for the day when science or circumstance might finally reveal their secrets. What weighed heaviest was the thought that somewhere this girl must have had family or friends who wondered and who missed her. How could it be that in all these years no relative had come forward? So this led to much speculation. Perhaps she had been a runaway for a long time and her family assumed she was living independently. Perhaps she had fallen through the cracks of a foster system or had no close kin to miss her. It was even possible that she might have not even been from the US originally, and she could be a foreign teen brought to the States. So investigators considered every single scenario, and they kept Cali Doe's dental records and later DNA profile on file, ready to compare against any new missing persons entries that might appear in the evolving national database. So, as the murder investigation dragged on without a suspect, detectives also weighed the possibility that the killer might have been an interstate serial offender. Because the late 1970s and early 1980s saw numerous serial killers operating across the Clover, and many targeting young women and runaways. It was only natural to wonder if Cali Doe had crossed paths with one of these predators. In 1984, a startling development emerged when Henry Lee Lucas, a drifter who became a notorious, or at least self-proclaimed, serial killer, confessed to murdering an unidentified girl in upstate New York. His story appeared to mirror the Caledonia case. At the time, Lucas was making national headlines for claiming responsibility for hundreds of murders across the country. He had been arrested in Texas and in custody was unloading tale after tale of homicidal exploits, some credible and many others fantastical. So when Lucas mentioned killing a girl in a cornfield in New York, investigators had to check it out. And he even roped in his companion, Otis Tull, claiming they were together when they picked up a girl hitchhiking near Philadelphia and later shot her in a New York cornfield. So on the surface, it sounded like it could fit. Tull and Lucas were known to have travelled together and had been spotted in upstate New York in 1979. So could these two infamous killers have been responsible for Colonia's Jane Doe? Upon closer investigation, authorities found Lucas's confession to be dubious at best. He was known as an attention seeker, who often fabricated stories to gain favour or notoriety. In this case, he failed to provide any details beyond what was already public knowledge. Investigators could not place Lucas or Tull definitively in the Caledonia area at the time of the crime, nor was there any evidence beyond Lucas's own words to connect them to the murder. Many of Lucas's confessions turned out to be outright lies. He was eventually dubbed the Confession Killer, after it became clear he had been falsely taking credit for murders he could not have committed. So the Texas Rangers eventually had to rescind many of the 200-plus cases that they thought Lucas solved, upon realizing he had been fed case details and was fabricating stories altogether. And Colonia's Jane Doe was one of those false confessions. Henry Lee Lucas did not kill her, and by the mid-1980s, investigators had officially ruled his claims not credible. The brief hope that the case was finally solved quickly evaporated, leaving only frustration in its place. But another serial predator that came under scrutiny was Christopher Wilder, a serial killer in 1984 who went on a multi-state spree, abducting and murdering young women across the US. Now, Wilder had ties to both Florida and New York and was known for his interest in car racing. At one point, Sheriff York speculated about Wilder, since the victim's racing-style jacket was the sort of item he might have owned or distributed. Wilder had been hiding out in upstate New York in mid-1979, evading law enforcement on other charges, which placed him in the region around the time of the murder. The scenario itself, a pretty teenage girl potentially lured by a charming older man, was not unlike Wilder's known modus operandi in later years. However, Wilder could not be conclusively linked to the Colonia case, and tragically or conveniently, Wilder was killed in a shootout with police in 1984, which meant investigators never got the chance to directly question him about the case. So the Wilder angle remained speculative, intriguing, but unproven, and just not enough evidence. In total, allegedly more than 60 known serial killers and murderers were considered and investigated in connection with the case. This roster included figures such as Lucas and Tull, along with numerous other violent offenders active around 1979. Each time a serial killer was apprehended, the team working on Cali Doe compared their timelines, habits, and known victims against the details of the cornfield murder. So, every possibility was run down. By the early 2000s, after a quarter century, the case remained unsolved and the victim unnamed. But it was not shelved. Investigators, both old and new, continued to feel a sense of duty about Cali Doe. And in 2005, a new opportunity arose because advances in forensic science were emerging that had the potential to do what old-fashioned detective work could not. The team prepared to leverage cutting-edge techniques to finally uncover the identity of their Jane Doe, even as the search for her killer remained a daunting challenge. By the mid-200s, Technology had caught up in ways that just breathed new life into many cold cases, including that of Colonia's Jane Doe. Investigators made a pivotal decision, and that was to exhume the remains of Jane Doe from her grave for advanced forensic testing. So with a court order in hand, the young girl's body was carefully disinterred from Greenmount Cemetery. It had been 26 years since her burial, yet modern science now offered capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction in 1979. The goal was twofold: to extract a viable DNA profile from her remains, and to apply new forensic techniques, such as isotope and pollen analysis, to glean clues about her life and origins. The exhumation proved successful. Using bone and tooth samples, forensic experts managed to recover DNA from the victim's remains. A major breakthrough, as they finally had a genetic fingerprint of the girl. While this did not instantly reveal her identity, it laid the groundwork for a possible future match. It also meant that if a relative of hers ever entered their DNA, the system could eventually connect the dots. So having her DNA on file was lighting a beacon in the darkness, basically. Now there was hope that one day the DNA might signal a match. Another advanced technique brought into play was forensic palynology, the study of pollen and spores trapped in a victim's clothing. In 2006, the girl's garments, preserved in evidence all those years, credit to the investigators, were sent to a laboratory at Texas A&M University for testing. A palynology expert then examined the microscopic pollen grains embedded in the fabric. And the results were fascinating, because among the pollen types identified were oak, spruce, and birch, as well as casuarina, which is Australian pine. Oak trees are widespread, but spruce and birch pollen was notable, because those particular species are common in the mountainous regions of California, not in western New York. None of the spruce or birch pollen found on her was present in a control sample from the cornfield itself, meaning she picked it up elsewhere. The biggest clue of all was the Australian pine pollen. This invasive tree grows in only a few places in the US, specifically South Florida, parts of South Texas, and 3 areas of California: North Bay, St. Louis, Obispo, and San Diego. An Australian pine cannot survive the winters in New York. There was no doubt the victim had been in one of those warmer regions not long before she died, so the pollen evidence led researchers to construct a possible travel narrative. They theorized that Jane Doe may have spent a considerable amount of time in Southern California or Florida, given the Australian pine pollen. The presence of spruce and birch that match California mountain species suggested she might have traveled through the Sierra Nevada region at some point, perhaps heading east. So, the investigators imagined a journey, maybe starting near the San Diego area, then moving through high-altitude areas, picking up spruce and birch, and eventually ending up in New York. Alternatively, Florida was still on the table, given Australian pine flourishes there and her notable suntan lines. In 2012, a re-examination of the pollen data reconfirmed that only California, Arizona, or Florida made sense as points of origin. In effect, science was echoing what the tan lines had first suggested: that this girl had come from far away. Alongside the pollen study, isotopic analysis was performed on her teeth and bones. This technique examines chemical signatures, such as oxygen isotope ratios embedded in the body, which shift according to regional water supplies and diet. Early tests on her tooth enamel indicated she had likely spent her early childhood in the southern or southwestern United States. And later bone isotope analysis further supported that her life history included significant time in a warm climate region. These subtle chemical clues aligned neatly with the pollen findings, pointing investigators to look west or south of New York when considering her identity. But the 2005 to 2006 forensic push didn't stop there, and the sheriff's office also engaged a forensic artist to help with a new facial reconstruction of Jane Doe. In 2010, an artist named Carl Kopelman volunteered his skills to draw a lifelike reconstruction of the girl's face. And Kopelman used the morgue photos and autopsy measurements to create a colour portrait that captured how Jane Doe might have looked in life. A pretty teen with feathered light brown hair, soft features, and a slight smile. He even drew her wearing a red jacket and turquoise necklace as she had been found to jog recognition. So this reconstruction was uploaded to the online databases, including NOM-US, which by 2010 had become a crucial tool for matching missing and unidentified cases. NOMUS allowed the public and law enforcement to access case profiles. For the first time, Cali Doe's information, physical stats, dental charts, DNA availability, and Cali's new portrait were all there on the internet, where anyone could stumble upon it and potentially make a connection. So, these forensic advancements were a huge leaps forward, and by 2010, investigators knew much more about Jane Doe. She was almost certainly from a sunny southern or southwestern state, had likely travelled cross-country, and had DNA and facial images available in national systems. For all this progress, she frustratingly remained nameless. She was a girl carrying a story told only through her remains and clothes, but her name was still missing from the narrative. And what the sheriff's department could not have predicted was that the final pieces of the puzzle would come not just from science, but from the emergence of a new kind of detective. As forensic experts pressed forward in the labs, a parallel effort was taking shape online. On message boards and early websites, amateur crime enthusiasts began piecing together the fragments of Jane Doe's story. The stage was set for two worlds, traditional law enforcement and crowdsourced investigation, to converge. By the early 2000s, as the Caledonia Jane Doe case adopted new forensic methods, another force emerged: the internet. True crime forums and online communities connected strangers across the globe, uniting them in a shared determination to give this young woman back her name. These web sleuths found each other on sites like webs.com, DO Network, and later on Reddit, pooling information on cold cases and unidentified remains. Mystery of Cali Doe naturally drew the attention of the growing community. Her case became one of the most talked about unsolved Jane Doe cases online, captivating a generation of armchair detectives determined to help where official investigations had stalled. On webs.com, a massive thread dedicated to Caledonia Jane Doe case was started as early as the early 2000s. Over the years, it grew to over 100 pages of discussion, theories, and painstaking research. Users pored over every available detail: the clothing, the keychains, the dinner sightings, the forensic clues. Forum members collaborated to generate hypotheses about Jane Doe's identity and background. One of the most dedicated contributors was Carl Kopelman. Kopelman discovered the Cali Doe case through web sleuth in the late 2000s and became fascinated. He was a professional accountant by day, but he volunteered countless hours to help identify missing persons and does. The web sleuths community kept the case alive in the public eye, a remarkable collective effort long before the word crowdsourcing became fashionable. What made that era distinctive was not only the endless theorizing, but the bridge it created between the public and law enforcement. By the 2000s, some investigators were quietly watching these forums, and in certain cases even engaging directly or asking for help from citizen sleuths. At the same time, the Doe Network catalogued the Caledonia Jane Doe as case file 1UFNY. The combined force of official forensic work and community-driven research fostered an environment where a breakthrough no longer felt impossible. So, the case that had languished for so long was about to be cracked open by the unlikeliest of alliances. a persistent high school friend with an aching question, a volunteer web sleuth with an eye for faces, and detectives willing to listen. The online community's collaborative efforts produced several compelling theories about Jane Doe's identity and life history, many of which we have briefly discussed. First, that she was a Florida runaway from a troubled home. Many noted the victim's deep tan lines and bikini lines and posited that she came from a warm, sunny state like Florida. Next, that she was from California, or West Coast traveller, given the pollen evidence of Australian pine and mountain spruces. And some sleuths believed she had spent time on the West Coast. There was also the question of whether she had been a victim of opportunity, rather than of a known assailant. Debate centred on whether her killer was a stranger, perhaps a trucker or serial predator who picked up a random hitchhiker, or someone familiar to her, such as a travel companion or boyfriend. But the fact that she ate dinner with the man and seemed at ease suggested to some that she might have trusted him, at least initially. But others argued that hitchhikers often accept meals from kind strangers. It could still have been a chance encounter turned deadly. The absence of clear defensive wounds left the motive uncertain. Web sleuths. Theories ranged from a robbery gone wrong to the possibility that the man had made an advance she rejected, sparking violence. Another idea soon gained traction, that the reason Jane Doe had never been identified was not because she lacked a family, but because no active missing persons report existed for her. Families sometimes choose not to report a runaway, believing she left by choice, or reports are lost in the system. This line of thinking would prove remarkably prescient. Investigators were, in effect, searching for someone who should have been reported missing, but wasn't. So this was an ambitious and difficult task, finding a void rather than a record. Through it all, the web sleuths community kept the case alive, in many ways preparing the ground for the eventual breakthrough. Over the years, they had gathered a wealth of knowledge and compiled lists of possible names. From that work, one name in particular was about to surface, brought forward by those who had known and cared for the girl while she was alive. The collaborative spirit of online sleuthing was about to intersect with a genuine missing person search, initiated by someone from the victim's past, showing how the line between amateur and professional detective work can sometimes blur to remarkable effect. So the long-awaited breakthrough in the case began with someone who remembered and missed the girl who had vanished so many years ago. In the early 2000s, a woman named Laurel Nwell started wondering about her old high school friend in Hernando County, Florida. The friend's name was Tammy Jo Alexander. Laurel and Tammy had been close in their early teens, but Tammy had dropped out of sight by the end of the 70s. Laurel searched for Tammy on Facebook and other sites, but found nothing. So concern grew. Was it possible that this lively, adventurous friend from their younger days had simply disappeared from the face of the earth? Laurel reached out and eventually connected with Pamela Dyson, Tammy Jo's half-sister, who still lived in Florida. Laurel discovered something shocking. No one in Tammy's family had heard from her since the late 1970s. Pamela had long assumed Tammy had simply run away to start a new life, since Tammy had a history of short disappearances. Maybe she had gotten married, or maybe she had kids somewhere. And their mother, Barbara, had apparently told police Tammy was missing back around 1979. But because Tammy was known to hitchhike and vanish, local police didn't take it seriously. Pamela and Laurel's inquiries in 2014 uncovered a bureaucratic failure. Because the Hernando County Sheriff's Office had no record of any missing person report or Tammy Jo, it seemed any initial report had been lost or never properly logged. In essence, Tammy was never officially listed as a missing person anywhere. So, realizing this egregious oversight, in August 2014, the Hernando County Sheriff's Office filed a fresh missing persons report for Tammy Jo Alexander. This marked the first time her name entered the national database as a missing teen. At last, Tammy's name appeared in national systems like NamUs and NCIC. though many years too late. Fate and the persistence of online investigators soon intertwined. When Tammy's new missing person profile, complete with an old high school yearbook photo, was added to NamUs in late 2014, it caught the attention of Carl Koppelman, who had long been deeply involved in the Caledonia Jane Doe case and had even sketched her portrait years earlier. By then, he was not only a web sleuth's moderator, but also someone actively monitoring NamUs for new cases. In September 2014, Carl came across Tammy's listing. A teen missing from Florida since 1979 and froze in recognition. The high cheekbones, the curve of the eyebrows, the wavy light brown hair with a hint of highlights, it all looked strikingly like the Cali Doe he had drawn. Carl later said, quote, "The very moment I saw her photo, it clicked. That was Colonia Jane Doe," unquote. All those hours studying Jane Doe's features for the reconstruction had paid off, and Carl Koppelman didn't waste a second. On September 20th, 2014, he emailed his contacts at the Livingston County Sheriff's Office, alerting them that the newly listed missing girl from Florida, Tammy Jo Alexander, was their long-identified Colonia victim. And he CC'd NamUs regional administrators and the Hernando County authorities in Florida, effectively connecting all the necessary parties. In his message, Carl likely laid out the key resemblances and circumstantial fits. Tammy's age, 16 in 1979, matching Jane Doe's estimated age. Her disappearance timeframe, spring 1979, which fits her death in November of 1979. Her Florida origin aligning with tan lines and pollen hints, and the high school photo that looked just like a younger version of Cali Doe. The law enforcement officials on both ends took this tip very seriously. And after 35 years of dead ends, it seemed almost unbelievable that a volunteer web sleuth might have solved it. But the logic was compelling, and Livingston County Sheriff's Thomas Dawes' team contacted Pamela Dyson, Tammy's half-sister, and arranged to collect a DNA sample for comparison. By late 2014, that sample was sent to a lab to perform a mitochondrial DNA test, or mtDNA, which can confirm maternal line relatives. Meanwhile, investigators pieced together Tammy's path. Family confirmed she had run away from home sometime in 1979 and never returned. An ex-boyfriend verified the last time he saw her was in the spring of 1979. She essentially vanished after that. All of it fit with the timeline of Cali Doe showing up dead in New York in November that year. So, as 2015 dawned, anticipation built. In January of 2015, the results finally came in, and the mitochondrial DNA from Jane Doe matched Pamela Dyson's DNA. So, the unidentified girl was indeed Tammy Jo Alexander. The long-lost teenager had her name restored, and authorities kept the news under wraps for a few days to notify family and prepare. On January 26, 2015, former Sheriff York held a press conference and delivered the incredible news. Colonia's Jane Doe had a name. After over 35 years, one of the nation's most enduring Jane Doe mysteries was solved. The room filled with triumph and poignancy. Investigators, some on the case since day one, felt relief and emotion. Sheriff Dorry voiced what everyone felt. Quote, "To be able to put a name on her, I can't even tell you what it means. We've always said one of the biggest parts of solving this case is knowing the victim." Unquote. At long last, they knew the victim. Tammy Jo Alexander, a 16-year-old girl from Florida. So, with DNA confirmation in hand, the authorities could finally close the chapter on Jane Doe and open a new one, centered on Tammy Jo Alexander. For Tammy's family and friends, the revelation was bittersweet. Pamela Dyson and Laurel Nwell, the sister and friend who had initiated the search, were grateful for answers, but devastated by the reality of Tammy's fate. Pamela had spent years holding on to a hopeful image that Tammy was out there, just living a happy life. The truth that Tammy had been dead the entire time, killed brutally as a teenager, was crushing. Pamela would say, quote, "I'm truly glad for the closure, but it hurts to know she died that way. It's terrible. Nobody should have to be shot and dragged out into the woods." So, Livingston County officials swiftly moved to give Tammy the dignity and death she had been denied for so long. The humble grave in Danville that had borne the inscription, "Unidentified Girl," was finally going to carry Tammy's name. A local funeral home actually donated a new headstone with her full name and dates, 1963 to 1979. On June 10th, 2015, a ceremony was held where the new Tammy Jo Alexander headstone was unveiled. About 100 people attended, including family members, townsfolk, and law enforcement, symbolizing how Tammy had bridged communities thousands of miles apart. The sheriff's deputies and townspeople who had cared for their Jane Doe all those years were finally able to address her by name and formally pay their respects. Carl Kopelman even flew out from California to attend. He felt a profound connection to Tammy and was honored to stand by as her name was rightfully returned. Tammy's family expressed a deep gratitude toward the Livingston County community for never forgetting her. They thanked officers like John York and Thomas Dorr, and the citizens who kept flowers on her grave and kept her story alive. Pamela Dyson became an advocate for missing persons, urging families of missing loved ones to enter their information into NAMUS and other databases. She emphasized that the database was critical in achieving her sister's identification, that her message was powerful. Had Laurel and Pamela not realized Tammy wasn't listed anywhere and taken action, she might still be a Jane Doe today. So their initiative, combined with the internet and Carl's sharp eyes, had finally broken the case. The ripple effects of Tammy's identification were felt far and wide. The FBI and law enforcement hoped that the high-profile success would encourage more collaboration with amateur sleuth communities. St. John Fisher College resident scholar in media Thomas Peretti noted that without the internet and social media, this case might never have been solved, saying, quote, "I really do think this played a critical role in putting the pieces together. Because as you know, cold cases each day get more and more difficult to solve. It's kind of like they're two icebergs going in the opposite direction. What social media allowed this to do is bring the two icebergs back together." Just referencing how Tammy's missing persons listing and the Jane Doe case converged online. This case stood as clear proof of the positive impact social media and crowdsourced investigation can have in solving long, cold cases. But even with Tammy's identity restored, another part of the story remained unresolved. Was who killed Tammy Jo Alexander? With her name known and her background coming to light, investigators redoubled their efforts on the homicide itself. Sheriff Dorey noted that identifying the victim is a huge part of solving a murder, but now they had to find the killer. The focus shifted from who is she to who was she, and who did this to her. The case now entered a new phase, buoyed by fresh leads that followed the uncovering of Tammy's past, as investigators turned back the clock to 1979 to retrace her last months. The hope was that clues from her life in Florida and her journey north could point to a suspect who had remained hidden all this time. With Tammy Jo Alexander's identity now known, a darker story of her life began to take shape. One that, when viewed in hindsight, makes her disappearance from the system seem tragically less surprising. Tammy's background was marked by instability, heartbreak, and yearning for escape, which tragically set the stage for her fateful journey. Tammy was born on November 2nd, 1963, in Atlanta, Georgia. And her early childhood in Georgia is less documented. But by the mid-1970s, she was living in Brooksville, Florida, a small town about 50 miles north of Tampa. Tammy's family life, by all accounts, was deeply tumultuous. Her mother, Barbara Jenkins, battled severe personal struggles, an addiction to prescription drugs, and volatile emotional swings that often erupted into fits of rage. Her biological father was absent entirely, leaving no presence in her life. Barbara remarried, giving Tammy a stepfather in the home. Tammy had an older half-sister, Pamela Dyson. But Pamela had a different father and left to live with her paternal grandmother when Pamela was around 11. This means by about 1972 or 1973, Pamela was out of the household. Young Tammy was left essentially as an only child in a very unhealthy home environment. Pamela would later remark that their mother's anger made Joan Crawford, the notoriously abusive Hollywood figure immortalized in Mommy Dearest, seem restrained by comparison. It paints a stark picture of Tammy's upbringing, a home where love was scarce and chaos was abundant. And given these conditions, it's not surprising that Tammy had a history of running away during her teenage years. She was just searching for freedom and adventure, and likely just peace away from this turmoil. When she was around 15, Tammy and her close friend Laurel Nowell started doing what many restless teens did in Florida, and that was hitchhiking rides with truckers and traveling to see the rest of the world. In one incredible episode, Laurel and Tammy daringly thumbed their way all the way to California in 1978. And two 15-year-old girls on the road crossing the country. Hard to imagine in our time, yet it truly occurred. When they reached Los Angeles, Laurel became scared and called her parents back in Florida. And her shocked parents bought plane tickets for both girls to fly home, bringing that runaway adventure to an end. That incident revealed both Tammy's courageous, impulsive spirit and the absence of steady parental guidance, since it was often other parents who had to step in and pull the girls back. When she returned to Florida, Tammy didn't stay settled for long. In her mid-teens, she worked alongside her mother as a waitress at a truck stop cafe. That job proved significant, as it placed her in constant contact with truck drivers and travelers moving across the country. Surrounded by stories of distant places, she had plenty of chances to imagine leaving, to catch rides, and to plan her own escapes. According to secondary sources citing the New York Daily News, Tammy Jo Alexander was described as being an experienced hitchhiker by age 15, and having caught rides with long-haul truckers while working at a truck stop cafe near home. So, by 1979, Tammy had both the itch to leave and the network truckers and fellow runaways to facilitate it. Multiple accounts from family and friends describe Tammy as a friendly, outgoing girl despite her home life. Quote, "People were just drawn to her," unquote, Laurel recalled, remembering Tammy's bright smile and bubbly personality. But behind the warmth was a desperation to get away from her mother's abuse. And Pamela Dyson, the half-sister, summarized it. Quote, "I believe Tammy left to escape a turbulent household. Indeed, Pamela felt guilt later, wondering if she'd stayed in home longer. Could she have protected Tammy, or convinced her to stick out? But Pamela had been just a kid herself when she fled to her grandma's house. So, by early 1979, Tammy was 15, going on 16, and seemingly reaching a breaking point. At one stage that year, records show Tammy ended up at the Rainbow Youth Ranch, also referred to as a prison ministry in Young Harris, Georgia. Now, this was essentially a Christian residential program in the mountains of northern Georgia, aimed at helping troubled teens, or those who had brushes with the law. It's not entirely clear how Tammy got there, But one theory is that juvenile court or social service placed her there to get her away from the bad environment. Perhaps after a runaway incident or minor delinquency, or her family might have sent her, hoping it would help reform her. Now, the stay at the ranch was in the summer of 1979. We know this thanks to the remarkable audio tapes that surfaced later. In July 1979, Tammy recorded a cassette of messages and songs, which she mailed to her boyfriend back home in Florida, while she was staying at the Georgia ministry. On that tape, her voice is upbeat and hopeful. Her sister would later recall that Tammy still sounded warm and positive, despite everything she was going through. At the same time, Tammy described a postcard she was holding. Moon over Miami, the alluring blue beauty of moonrise shimmering over the Atlantic Ocean in Florida. On it were 2 palm trees, the moon over the water, and a girl in a white shirt and black pants. Tammy called it beautiful, completely beautiful. By the end of the summer of 1979, she had either returned to Florida or left the ranch on her own accord. What we do know is that by autumn of that year, Tammy Joe Alexander once again set out on the road, and this time, it would be for good. Her exact movements are still a bit of a jigsaw puzzle, but investigators have pieced together some of it. At 16, Tammy had her whole life ahead of her, but she chose to take a chance at a different life than the one she'd known. It appears Tammy left Brooksville, likely in early fall of 1979. Her high school boyfriend, a young man named Kevin, the ones who kept her tapes, last saw her in the spring of 79. By the new school year, she wasn't around. Perhaps after turning 16 in November of 1979, she had hoped to celebrate freedom. But instead, by early November, she had somehow traveled roughly 1,100 miles from Florida to upstate New York. So, how did Tammy go from Florida to New York? But as mentioned before, given her history, the most plausible scenario is she hitchhiked rides with truckers or other travelers heading north. It's possible Tammy may have made a friend, perhaps even a boyfriend, at the Georgia ranch or somewhere along the way. Someone who was traveling and whom she decided to join. Investigators believe that on November 9th, 1979, Tammy shared what would be her last meal at the Lima Diner, in the company of an unidentified man. She had likely only just arrived in the region shortly before that night. So, it's conceivable she was making her way toward the big city, maybe Boston or Canada, given the hitchhiking to Boston mentioned, and just happened to cross paths with a predator. Or maybe she had some plan to stay with someone that fell through. We might never know for sure why Tammy was in Colonia, but tragically, within perhaps 24 hours of being in that area, she was killed. And one heartbreaking detail that came out after Tammy was identified was that her mother, Barbara Jenkins, died in 1998 at the age of 56. In Barbara's obituary, the family listed Tammy Joe Alexander as deceased, and that had no proof. But by then, almost 20 years after Tammy's disappearance, they assumed she must have died because she never contacted anyone. It's unclear if Barbara truly believed that, or if it was a way to find closure. Barbara passed away never knowing what had happened to her daughter. It was a tragic footnote in an already tragic story. A troubled mother who lost her troubled child and was left without answers. Pamela later admitted that, until Tammy was finally identified, she clung to a comforting fantasy. That her sister had found what they themselves never had at home: stability and love. The confirmation in 2015 shattered that illusion, but it also ended the years of uncertainty and allowed the family to finally mourn Tammy properly. Tammy's story is that of a girl failed by those who should have protected her, who seized her fate with youthful boldness, chasing freedom and adventure. only to collide with deadly danger. Her life resonates as a cautionary tale of the era. The 1970s saw many lost teenagers like Tammy, fleeing troubled homes, only to encounter even darker realities on the road. It just underscores why, in the wake of Tammy's case, systems for reporting and tracking missing children have improved. In 1979, there was no National Missing Kids Network, no Amber Alerts, no NOM-US. Today, one hopes a girl like Tammy would not fall through the cracks so easily. With a fuller picture of who Tammy Joe Alexander was, investigators could now refocus on the biggest unanswered question. And that is, who took the life of Tammy Joe? The identification sparked new leads as police tracked Tammy's final steps and companions. Now, armed with her name in history, they began the renewed hunt for a killer that, for all anyone knew, might still be out there. Perhaps even watching the news that the Jane Doe they thought would never be identified now had a name. So the identification of Tammy Joe Alexander was a monumental step forward. But it was not the end of the case. Rather, it was the beginning of an active homicide investigation with a clear direction. With Tammy Joe's background uncovered now, detectives could retrace her path and contacts in 1979 to hunt for suspects, and new leads poured in after the 2015 announcement, as people across the country realized that the long-ago missing Brooksville girl and the famous Colonia Jane Doe were one and the same. The FBI joined local law enforcement in a fresh push for information. In early 2015, the FBI put up billboards nationwide featuring Tammy's photo and details of the case, asking for the public's help to find the killer. This campaign led to a surge of tips. By the end of February 2015, the Livingston County Sheriff's Office reported that they received many new leads, enough to start developing a working theory of Tammy's travels in her final days. While they did not release that scenario publicly in full, they indicated that they had a better sense of how she might have arrived in Colonia. And one intriguing lead came from a trucker in Tennessee, who contacted authorities after hearing Tammy's story on a radio broadcast. He remembered a young girl matching Tammy's description from that time. We don't have the exact details of the sighting, but police called it significant, implying Tammy was indeed spotted on the road during her odyssey. Although specifics were not disclosed, we can speculate. Perhaps this truck driver recalled giving a ride to a girl he now believes was Tammy, or he saw Tammy with someone suspicious at a truck stop in late 1979. Tennessee lies on a route between Florida and New York, so if Tammy hitchhiked up the I-75 or I-95, and then west or north passing through the Appalachians, it's plausible a trucker out of Tennessee had encountered her. This kind of eyewitness account, even decades old, can be surprisingly detailed. Truckers often remember unusual passengers or events vividly, and investigators likely followed up rigorously on this, trying to corroborate times and places that match Tammy's known timeline. Then there was the matter of Tammy's time at the Young Harris, Georgia ministry that summer. It was in March of 2015. The Sheriff's Department revealed that they discovered Tammy had ties to a former prison ministry in Georgia that worked with youth on probation or parole. And this is clearly referencing the Rainbow Youth Ranch. Investigators noted that the ministry itself was long defunct and its founders had passed away, making direct interviews with staff impossible. Still, they managed to track down a few people connected to it. The central question remained: did Tammy meet someone at the ranch who might have harmed her or taken her on the road? The program was known to work with troubled young men and women. It's possible one of them left around the same time Tammy did. Records from the ranch may have listed fellow attendees or visitors. Mentions of individuals on probation or parole opened another line of inquiry. Could a recently released offender from the area have been traveling north and crossed paths with Tammy? perhaps even an ex-convict volunteer, or someone tied to the ministry who offered her a ride. In early 2016, the police disclosed they had identified 3 male persons of interest who had known Tammy before her death. They didn't publicly name these men, but it was said that they were part of Tammy's life or circle back then. It's likely these included perhaps a boyfriend or acquaintance from Florida, or maybe a trucker or friend of a friend who had been in contact. Investigators worked to locate these persons of interest decades later. Impressively, they did find them. They collected DNA samples from all 3 men to any forensic evidence from Tammy's case. This was a major step, as getting these men's DNA on record would allow police to either include or exclude them if any DNA from the crime scene existed. By November 2016, the FBI reported that none of the 3 persons of interest DNA matched the sample taken from Tammy's clothing. In other words, those 3 men were not the source of the unknown male DNA found in this case. So, this presumably cleared those individuals of direct involvement in her murder, or at least they weren't the ones who left trace evidence. The elimination of those suspects might seem like a setback, but it was actually progress, and it narrowed the field. Their interviews might still have provided useful context, even if they weren't the killer. Perhaps one of them knew Tammy's plans, or last companions, because after Tammy was identified in 2015, investigators publicly said they were revisiting witnesses and leads. Reporting identifies that Lima Diner waitress Marge Bradford as the last known person to see Tammy alive. She described the teen's male companion, tan station wagon, black wire-rimmed glasses, and the meal that they shared that night. They revisited the original scene and evidence with fresh eyes, and modern forensic labs re-examined Tammy's clothing, the bullet, and any other items for hints that might have been missed. One big advantage of identifying Tammy was being able to chart her movement from Florida to Georgia, perhaps some stopovers, and then New York, where she was murdered. Investigators likely checked if any other crime occurred along a path Tammy might have taken around late 1979 that could be related. For instance, was there a pattern of hitchhikers or any cases of harm-similar shootings of women? Because they had already looked at serial killers earlier, but now with Tammy's known journey, certain suspects might become more or less likely. So far, law enforcement has not publicly named any prime suspect, though. But they emphasized that the case is very much active, and that the original man, curly-haired, glasses-wearing in a station wagon, remains at the center of the investigation. Over the years, composite sketches of him have been circulated, and they hope someone might recognize him. One of the most promising angles in the search for Tammy's killer is the DNA evidence gathered from the crime. Back in 1979, they likely didn't have the ability to recover much from the body due to the rain and lack of S evidence. However, it appears that with modern methods, investigators managed to find some male DNA on Tammy's clothing when they re-examined it in post-identification. Now, they haven't publicly clarified what kind of DNA. It could be touch DNA like skin cells on her jacket or pants, or perhaps bodily fluid like a bit of sweat or saliva. But it's enough to have a male profile which they've been actively analysing. By 2020, officials announced that they were leveraging cutting-edge forensic genealogy techniques to try to identify the source of that male DNA. This is the same approach that famously caught the Golden State Killer, but using genealogical databases to find relatives of the unknown DNA profile and build a family tree to a suspect. So, the FBI was reported to be testing the DNA against national databases in search of a familial link to the killer. Sheriff's Office Captain Brian Appen confirmed. We have been and are exploring DNA avenues in the case, including the ancestral DNA angle. No new information available on that at this time, but this indicates they've likely uploaded the suspect's DNA profile to genealogical services with law enforcement access like GED Match or Family Tree DNA. As of the latest updates, no match or close familial hints have been announced, meaning the killer's relatives either aren't in those databases or the connections are too distant so far. But this work is ongoing, and it can take time, especially if the suspect came from a lineage not well represented in the databases. It's worth noting that DNA technology is advancing very quickly. So, if the team hasn't found a match yet, a future improvement or database growth could suddenly make a difference. And additionally, the FBI has offered a $20,000 reward for information leading to the killer's arrest. They hope that even decades later, someone who knew something might feel compelled or financially motivated to speak up. Perhaps a killer confided in a friend or family member at some point, or witnesses who stayed silent might finally break their silence. So, Tammy Jo Alexander's story is not over yet, and the dedicated individuals pursuing her case will not rest till the question that has echoed since 1979 is answered. And that is, who killed Tammy Jo? This isn't the end of the story. As always, stay safe, stay sharp, and I'll see you next time.